So this story goes back exactly 10 years to October 2015 and a water in Surrey called Nutty Lane. It was a water that I'd actually heard about over the years, different things well before that, an old established water that had been fished by some very well-known anglers, but going with it, it had a reputation of being rock hard, very low stock. To say the least. It wasn't in the nicest area, so it wasn't the most secure and safe water, and I'd heard a few horror stories of people who'd fished there and how unsafe it was. And whilst I'd always listened to the stories because it was fairly close to my home, I became friendly with a guy who had fished it a lot, and I sat with him a number of occasions, and he sort of taught me through what it was like on there and how quiet it was and what a challenge it was. And I started to become a little bit more interested in it, and obviously I listened to what he said, and the thought of a bit of quiet fishing appeals to us all, and he told me a lot about it, and he'd been successful over time on there. And the big change, I suppose, was the year before that, 2014, another good friend of mine, Wayne Barrett, he caught the big fish from there, which was called Daisy, and he sent me a photo of it some months later. And when I saw the photo, that kind of changed a lot for me, because it was a mega fish, and to see the picture that he had and look at it, I definitely started to not make plans, but yeah, be interested in it. And it was very low stock, and you had the big one, this fish known as Daisy, and not many other fish. So in a way, that Daisy did a lot of its captures, and that was really what you were going on there for. And when 2015 came, I had thought a bits about it, and I had my other friend Adam telling me more and more, and we got to that summer, and I remember asking him, I said, look, would you take me over there for a look? I mean, he didn't have the ticket anymore, but he knew how to get in. He took me there one July day, I think it was a Sunday afternoon, and I sort of begged him to take me over there, and I wasn't set about fishing it. I just really wanted to have a look at the lake more than anything else. And we walked in through this gate, and we parked up in Nutty Lane itself first, and it isn't the greatest place to park. It was full of fly tip, there were people sat in cars looking at you, it's like a dead end road, and I thought, I don't really like this, but we left the car and I walked in through this gate, and Adam had the code, and we got in and we sort of saw this lake, and I remember looking at it and thinking, God, this is a lot bigger than I thought it was going to be. And I guess looking at it, it was probably 15 to 17 acres size. It was certainly bigger than I thought it was going to be, and it was a big expanse of open water. And we started walking around it, and he took me down the first bank, which has a little river stream behind it, and it was wild as a lake. I mean, the paths were overgrown, there were big trees over the path that you had to duck down, there were great big tunnels of massive brambles, and there were no manicured swims, and they were little basically holes in the bushes, and even the swims were all overgrown. And I mean, I was glad I wore long trousers, because you would have been cut to pieces. And we sort of got round it, and it was pretty intimidating, to be honest with you, more than anything. I mean, the lake itself had a huge bar down the middle of it that was sticking out the water because the water level was really low. And when I say bar, it wasn't like a gravel bar you expect from lakes. It was a bar just of big slabs of concrete and bricks and huge great pieces of stone, really, and not the sort of thing you want to be fishing on or nearby. And I could see within a few hundred yards of walking around there what a challenge it was going to be. And one side had a big field on it which you weren't allowed to fish in, and then as you got further down that bank there was a big point swim, and we stood on this point swim and looked across the lake, and yeah, mega. I mean, you were blown away really by it, but I could tell what, with the lack of fish in there and what it was like with the snags and the features, it was going to be a proper challenge. And I suppose the biggest thing of that day was you couldn't help notice the colour of the water. It was the greenest algae green I've ever seen, even to this day, of any lake. It was like gloss paint green, and I looked at it and I honestly I think if you'd have thrown a boilie in, it was that thick it wouldn't go through it. And it was like an oil slick over the whole lake. Every acre of the lake was this bright green that had this horrendous stagnant smell, and it smelt like dead fish. All the trees round the lake were stained green where the level had dropped, and it was just motionless, stagnant green. And I said to Adam, I said, you know, I've never seen anything like this. And he said, yeah, this is what it's like in the summer every year. And I remember we got back to the sort of start of the lake, and I just said to him, well, I'm not fishing that. I said, I've never seen anything that bad in my life. And just for that reason alone, I sort of discounted it. We went out the gate and I thought, yeah, lovely lake and whatever, but you know, I'm just not going to fish there. And we sort of went off, and that was it. I think a couple of weeks or so after that, I went away on holiday with my family, and I sort of, that 2 weeks I was away, I spent a lot of time thinking about what I'd seen, and you know, if I was going to fish it, how I would fish it. And I sort of, it definitely made an impression on me, because I did spend a lot of time thinking about it. And the lake itself was amazing. And I was thinking, well, he did tell me it wasn't going to be this bad and forever. And anyway, I got back, and by then it was sort of end of August, and probably first week of September. And as soon as I got back, I said to Adam, let's go back down there. Will you take me back down? And on the sort of windward end of the lakes, there was this algae tide, and the sort of back of the wind, the algae had broken up and cleared. So whilst it was still pretty bad, it had definitely broken up, and it wasn't as bad. I mean, saying that, it still wasn't great, but I looked at that, and you know, he said, look, it's only going to get better than this. And I thought, all right, look, let's give it a go. And it's funny now looking back how things fall into place, because at exactly that time, the beginning of September, the guy that ran it introduced a half-season ticket that started on the 1st of September. So you didn't have to buy a whole year's ticket. It was a cheap ticket anyway, but I could get a ticket that started there and then, which was one thing. And the second thing was he actually got some secure parking there. So instead of parking in the road with all the fly tip and everything, he got a gated car parking area on one side of the lake. And that changed a lot for me. I thought, well, you know, my car's going to be safe, and sort of all fell into place a bit really with that alone. And so I got the ticket, and I thought, right, this is it. I'm going to fish it. And I didn't really have a lot else going on there. And I thought, I'll give it a go. And I told some friends of mine, and a couple of them said to me, that's going to destroy you. It's so hard, and you know, it's so difficult. And I thought, well, in my head, I thought, do you know what? It's probably going to be mid-September by the time I start. I'm only going to have 6-8 weeks before the weather turns bad, and I'm going to stop. I thought, let's give it a go, you know, mid-September to probably, you know, beginning of November time, and see what it's like, you know, get into it, and then you're back next spring. And so I went about doing a little bit of research first, and I knew that the stock was only probably 15 fish, and you had Daisy, the lake's big, and you had another mirror that was mid-30 that I think by then had only been out once or twice, and then you had a few sort of 20-pound commons. There was no real backup other than Daisy, the big one. And as I say, 15 to 17 acres, maybe 15 fish. It was you know, gonna be tricky. I knew that, but I did have some knowledge that the previous October Wayne had caught her from one end, and I knew she liked this one end of the lake, and specifically in the autumn time. And I thought, well, I've only got a few weeks. Let me start down that end and sort of break the lake up a little bit. And if I started down that end, I could have some sort of good eyes on the water down there. And I was in an area which I knew she'd been out before from, and it was a good starting place. So I kind of had something to go on. And there were basically two swims. They were quite well apart, but they covered the bottom end of the lake, which I would guess is probably sort of 7 or 8 acres of the lake. And I just spent all my time in those two swims, getting to know them. And one was called the Terrapin, which was a second to last swim. And then there was what's called the end swim right at the end of the lake. And you had the end of the lake to your right and the field opposite you where you weren't allowed to fish down there. And I spent just time in each with a marker float, logging everything down and just trying to find some spots. And that Terrapin swim, it was like amazing. You could have fished 20 rods in there. There was features everywhere, from the margins to 120 yards out, bars, gravelly bits, silty bits, overhanging margins. And it took me a long time in there to sort of narrow it down a bit. And then when I went into that end swim, it was a little bit easier. There was this big central bar, which by now was underwater, that I sort of didn't really want to go near because I'd already seen what it was made up of. And there were some nice closer in features I found. And so I'd sort of started off that way. And I had a plan that when I went into one of those two swims, I could get in there, I could get my rods out on stuff I already knew, and then I was just going to use my eyes as much as I could to see if I had anything to go on. And I think it was probably about mid-September by the time I actually fished. And you know, obviously I'd been down there quite a bit before, and I went down, and I remember doing just a single overnighter was all I had. And it was the first time I'd loaded the car with fishing gear, you know, and I'd got there, loaded the barrow and pushed it round, which was a mission in itself because all the path was covered with, you know, great big exposed roots. It was narrow. You were trying to get your barrow through these brambles and duck your head down over the trees. And anyway, I got into that end swim, and I just thought, let's give it an overnighter and see what happened. And I got my rods out on the spots I'd found, and it was, you know, a magic feeling, to be honest, to be somewhere like that. And there was no one else there, and I set up and I did the night. And I remember the next morning it was blowing like a westerly, which was straight into me, and I was in this little swim where I could only get a brolly in. It was really narrow and tight, and the wind came straight into me with some sort of misty, dull autumn rain, and there was just no way you could get out of it. And I sat on my bed chair getting soaked as this rain came across me. But it was one of those autumn mornings that was dull and sort of warmish, and it was mega conditions. And I sat there, and then I suppose with all these captures you need a bit of luck, and that morning I had a massive bit of luck because as I sat there I saw a fish show, which was the first fish I'd seen show on there, which was one of the commons, and it showed out in front of me, but well out in front of me. And then about half an hour later, as I stood there looking, that daisy came out straight in front of me, probably 3/4 of the way across to the field bank, and it was definitely her. And I was looking straight at her as she came out, this great big grey mirror, and I thought, well, she's down this end. And that was really a massive bit of luck that I needed, and to actually fish your first trip and see her was, you know, more than I could have asked. And it was then really a couple of weeks before I knew I could get back. I had stuff on at work, but I was still going down there as every chance I could, and I was walking round, and I remember I had a trip planned, and I was going to go down there, and I'd heard there was actually somebody down there, and I thought, you know what, I don't want to show my hand, I'll just leave it. And I didn't go, and I went over to Kingsmead 1 actually that week. I think it was first week of October, and I actually had a 40-pounder fishing over there, but I sort of didn't want to be there. But anyway, I had a week away, and the following week after that, I had a week of night shift at work, which was like Monday to Monday. And so I really used that week of night shifts that I was going down there every day, because I'd finish work at 5, 6 in the morning, and I had the whole day till I went back in at 10 o'clock at night. And I spent a lot of time down there that week, and by then I was starting to introduce bait, and my focus was all on that end swim where I'd seen her. So I had sort of generally a couple of spots there, and I just introduced them. I'd go down with a marker rod, and again that swim was too tight to use wrap sticks. I had to put the marker out every time to find the spot, and I'd take my little bucket with the catapult, and I would just introduce a few baits, and I'd often just sit on the bucket for, you know, an hour or so and watch the lake. But what also I suppose was pretty significant was 2 or 3 times that week I went down there after work. So it was like 5:30 in the morning, and by then it was into October and it was dark, and I walked round that lake 2 or 3 times that week in the dark. After doing that, it was almost like I felt accepted by the lake. You know, I'd been round there in the day, and as I said before, it's quite a daunting, intimidating place, and it's almost quite creepy as well. And when it's so dark over there, and they're really narrow paths, if you were going to bump into anybody, it was so narrow you couldn't avoid them. And you had these trees you had to duck round, and roots you had to step over. And I'd put some bait in, and I was sat on the bucket, and a fish rolled an hour after I'd put the bait in. And again, I thought, well, you know, there's fish down here, and I'd seen fish, so on such a low stock lake, again, it was a confidence booster. And it was a really good week that. I learned a lot that week. And you know, people have said to me after, oh, I bet you were piling the bait in, and I wasn't, because you're fishing really for one fish. You know, it's not a big stocked water. It's not somewhere that putting kilos and kilos of bait in was going to do me any good. You know, you wanted a bite. So yeah, I was putting bait in, but I was putting in, you know, 50 baits on a spot. I wasn't putting kilos in, and I was putting a little bit in because I was hoping something was going to visit, and if something was going to visit, it was only going to be 1 or 2 fish. So that was what I did round there, you know, little pouchfuls of bait, and that's how I approached it that week. And as the week got on and the weekend, I was starting to look more and more forward to the following week, and things were sort of falling into place a bit really. And I'd had that build up of knowledge, and I was ready to start fishing it, and I didn't have long left. I knew probably a month. And the week after the night shifts came, and I spent the Monday at home, and I went down there on the Tuesday, and I took enough gear for 3 nights, and I barrowed over to the swim, and again there was no one there. And I left a lot of stuff in the car that I didn't need, just because of how awkward it was to get there. I just took enough for sort of one day at a time to make it easier. And I got there on the Tuesday, and I got in the swim, and it was like muscle memory now. I'd cast the marker float out there so many times that I knew exactly what was there. And there was a little bar close in to my right. There was not much more than a long underarm out, and it was silty behind there, and it was a good little feature and a good area. And out to the left, I'd found a spot. There was a house on the end of this field opposite, a long way away, and at the apex of the roof, aiming at that, there was a lovely silty area, and then you got a little gravel patch, but it was the really fine pea gravel where you got that really gentle tapping. You know, you could almost miss it if you didn't pull the lead across it slowly enough, and you got that little dink, 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 and then you were off it. And I used to pop the float on that little gravel area, and again, I suppose it was 25 yards out. They were the spots I thought, right, I've got them. I hadn't found anything better. That's what I'm going to stick with. And by now, it was easy for me to find it. I'd done it so many times, and I put my rods out there, and you know, a little bit of baiting, and it was nice, stealthy fishing because it was close in. I was using the fluorocarbon, and I had my lines sunk down, and you know, light leads, and my favourite stiff hinge rigs, and you know, catapult range. So from that point of view, it was nice, easy fishing. But you've obviously always got the doubts that are the spots right on a hard water like that, and you're not going to know till you get a bite, really. But from what I'd found, and even the time I'd spent in the other swims, they seemed really good to me. You know, they were what I was looking for. And I got there that day, and I put my rods out, and nothing happened that day. I didn't see anything, but what did happen was we had a massive change in the weather. It was the following morning was the 16th of October, and I woke up the following morning. I hadn't had anything, I hadn't seen anything, and we had this big northeasterly wind come in and clear skies. And that morning we had the first frost, and I'd fished that night, and I woke up in the morning, and it was, you know, there was frost on the brolly, and it was cold. It was the first one of the year, and we had this quite big wind that luckily was over my head, and clear skies, and the leaves were falling down by now, and it actually looked a massive change from all the times I'd been up there before. It was a big change in the weather. And as you walk down to the swim, you walk through this sort of tunnel of sloe bushes, and because of the first frost, all the sloe berries were falling off this sort of tunnel as you walk down into the swim, and they were all over the floor. I was treading on these sloe berries everywhere. And I remember that day I thought, oh, how do you make sloe gin? And I looked at these sloe berries everywhere, and I thought, well, I've got to take some of these home. So I filled the bucket, and I was researching how to make sloe gin. And anyway, at about lunchtime, I wound in to go back to the car to get some more water, and I walked down the lake, and I remember looking at this cold wind, and luckily it was over my head, so my side was flat calm. But when I went over the other side, there was this freezing cold wind, and I stood at the very end of the lake, and I looked up this big bit of water, and with this wind and bleak looking, and I thought, this is just going to be, this could be really out of my league, to be honest. I think this could be a challenge too far. And just with the change that day, and just looking at the lake from that angle, the big bit of water, and I was like, I didn't have a wobble, but I thought, this is pretty daunting, this, and it's a big arse to get anything from here. But I got my water, and I went back to the swim, and I remember phoning Wayne, and obviously Wayne had it the year before, and Wayne was like, how's it going? And I said, look, honestly, I'm thinking of cutting it short. It looks pretty poor, to be honest, and I'm not really feeling it. And I remember him saying to me, no. He said, last year I had her the day after the first frost of the year. And he said it was really cold, and we'd had that frost, and no, stick with it. And I remember him saying that to me. Even now I can remember his voice on the phone, and I was looking at this bleak bit of water thinking, you know, this is pretty dire. And he was, no, stick with it, that's when I had her. And you know, so I put the rods out, and it was sort of mid-afternoon by now, and I thought, no, you know, I'll stick with it. And I knew I'd done a lot of work, but I thought, well, if I'm beaten, it's the conditions and whatever. But I put the rods out, and I remember that left-hand rod, which was on that sort of fine gravelly spot. I put a hinge rig out with a dull sort of pink pop-up on, and I would have to put the marker float sort of next to it and then cast to the float. And I did this cast, and I can remember it really vividly now, that I held it back, and the rod went down, and it was quite deep out there, and I got this drop like I'd never got before. I mean, it thudded down like, you know, way better than the one I'd had the day before when I put the rod out, and way better than any times I'd put marker float out there on the braid. And this cast was using fluorocarbon, and I got this drop, and I just thought, I was like, gee, I've never felt a drop, and I was like, that's the one, you know, and fired a few baits out on it, and I can remember it to this day. I'd never had a drop like that on that spot, and it was a small spot, it wasn't big, and I'd cast on it so many times, and that one day I got that drop. And anyway, I sort of sat back and sat looking, and I'd seen nothing, you know, gone from the previous morning to that afternoon, looking, and you have a great view of sort of that bottom end of the lake from there. I'd seen nothing, and I sat there, and about 5:30 I had this ripping take on my left-hand rod, on that rod with the drop, and I had the lines hanging from the rod tip because it was close in. I had them slack and all on the bottom, and I'd had this take completely out the blue. I was sat looking at my rods, and it's melted. I suppose, you know, I've got a slack line and it's going, and I picked the rod up, and I think it's probably one of the only times, even now, 10 years later, that I picked the rod up, and within seconds I knew exactly what fish I had on the end. There was no doubt about it. I had this great big deep thumping, and the rod bent over, and I knew it was her straight away. And my legs are shaking, and you know, to know that early, it's not like playing a fish and seeing it roll and going, oh, that's the one. I knew instantly it was her, and I thought, well, never mind, she's like an old one, she's going to give up pretty easily. And she was the opposite. She thumped about, great big deep boring runs, slow and plodding, but super powerful. And I'm in this really tight swim, and there was a big snag tree, and she's trying to go to the snags, and I'm side straining her, and all the time I'll admit it, I was shaking. My heart was pounding, my hands were shaking, my legs were like jelly, and I thought, this is her. I could never ever get this chance again. And I'm just like, don't fall off, please. You know, this is my moment. Again, I mean, I knew it was her, and I probably never felt as nervous playing a fish in my life. And I'm thinking, just give up, please, just give up. And I must have had her on for well over 5 minutes before I even saw her. I had a few of those sort of tail rolls under the surface where the big boils come up, and I'm thinking, trying to give her a bit more to actually see her, and I just never got a glimpse of her. And then suddenly she rolled, and I saw the one scale, and I saw this grey mirror, and I thought, you know, I knew it already. I didn't need to see her. And I had a few more agonising minutes of plodding round, and I'm trying to get the net in, and I've got 2 other rods and a tiny little gap, and she came up, and then she'd go off again, and it was horrible, to be honest. It wasn't a pleasure, but you know, your nerves are going, and then finally she came up, and I remember getting the net under her, and I just dropped the rod, and I lifted the net up and thinking, just don't get out, and she was in there, and I rolled the net on its side, and I had this photo of Wayne with her from the year before, and I only had one side of Wayne's photo, and it was a side with one big scale, and she was lying on that side in the net, and I tipped the net, and I saw this big scale, and I was like, it's her. And it was, you know, probably the pinnacle of my angling. That moment to see her in the net was, you know, this feeling that we all go fishing for, I suppose. And it was, did I believe I could catch her? Yeah, I thought I had a good chance, but you're never going to know it. But you could only try your best, and I knew it was going to be a massive task, but to see her in my net was one of the best feelings in fishing. And I got her out, and I put her in the sack, and I started making a couple of phone calls, and I was like, I've got her, and I phoned Wayne, and Wayne said, right, I'm on the way down. And another good friend of mine, Jim, bless him, who you know, he was like, look, you know, I said, I can't, she's an old fish, I can't leave her in the sling. By then it was dark, it was like 6:30 in the evening, and I thought, I've just got to do these photos. I had her, and I just wanted to get her back. And they came down, bless them, and we got the fish out, and we did the photos, and it was great to hold her there and have them. And you're always worried with a big fish like that, and everything went well, and we did the photos, and it was great to have that time with two good friends as well. And you know, again, it was all part of the journey to have your friends there and share something like that. And I got her back, and I had no rods out. I put them away because of how tight the swim was, and they brought down a few beers, and we had a couple of beers, and I sat there and with them, and then they went, and I thought, well, I'm supposed to be down for 2 more nights, and I'd had a few beers, as you do, and I stayed there for the night, and I had no rods out. They were all in the hold all at the back of the thing, and I just spent the night there. And I woke up in the morning, and it was this glorious autumn dawn and cold again, and it was just magic. The feeling to have done it was amazing. I didn't need anything else. It was like, I've done it, and I've had her. And I had a slow pack up that morning, and I thought, you know, 2 nights, and I just thought how lucky I was. You know, I had a serious piece of luck, you know, to get a fish like that in that period of time. And I could have been on there for years, and you know, you do make your own luck, and I did work hard, but I had a massive bit of luck to get her. And I packed up that morning, and I took my bucket of sloe berries that I'd picked, and I took them home, and I made the sloe gin when I got home, with sugar and gin and the sloes. And you know, here we are 10 years later, October 2025, and I still have that bottle of sloe gin that I made that day. And every 16th of October I take a drink of that sloe gin that I made from the sloes in that swim at Nutty Lane, and I have the bottle, you know, sloe gin, Daisy, Nutty Lane, and I have a little drink and think about that fish and how lucky I was to get it, and what a fantastic bit of angling. And even now, and when I left that day, I had a bit of sadness leaving. You know, obviously a great feeling to catch her, but I also felt sad because of what an amazing place it was, and how much I enjoyed the little bit I'd done down there. And you know, if I'd have been on there for longer, I would have enjoyed it. And you know, as well as the elation of the capture, I had a bit of sadness that I was not fishing it anymore, and that was the end of the chapter. And I've left, and I went back once when my friend caught her the following year, and to this day I've never been back, and it's all in the memory now, and a really special memories, and you know, a really amazing capture, lucky, and you know, one of the best captures in my fishing life I'm ever going to get.